263 Chinese ships showed up in the waters around Taiwan last month alone, a number that's climbed steadily for 3 straight months in a row, and Taiwan's own Coast Guard just confirmed it publicly, describing what they're now calling a significant, unmistakable rise in Chinese activity right on their doorstep. The Pentagon is tracking every single one of these movements in real time, because this isn't just routine naval traffic anymore. It's part of a pattern that's been building steadily for over a year now, and the numbers behind it should genuinely concern anyone paying attention to what's actually happening in the waters around Taiwan right now. Let me walk you through exactly what's been happening, because when you actually lay out the full pattern of Chinese naval and Coast Guard activity around Taiwan over these past several months, you start to understand exactly why American defense officials are watching this situation as closely as they possibly can. Let's start with the numbers that just came out, because they tell the story about as clearly as anything can. According to a Taiwanese Coast Guard official speaking on condition of anonymity specifically to share this information with the media, a total of 263 Chinese ships, including Coast Guard vessels, rescue ships, and research vessels, were detected in waters around Taiwan and its outer islands during the month of June alone. Compare that to just 200 ships detected the month before that, and only 171 ships during that exact same month 1 year earlier, back in June of 2025. Do the math on that trajectory for a second. That's roughly a 50% increase in Chinese vessel activity around Taiwan compared to the exact same period just 12 months ago. And it's part of a clear, steady, month-over-month upward trend that shows absolutely no sign of slowing down. And here's a detail that makes this number even more significant. The 263 figure doesn't even include Chinese warships. This is purely Coast Guard, rescue, and research vessels. The actual warship presence is being tracked entirely separately, and according to detailed reporting from the Wall Street Journal, China has maintained what amounts to a near-constant naval presence of 5 to 6 actual warships positioned around Taiwan at any given moment throughout 2025, a dramatic increase compared to earlier years when that kind of sustained, continuous military presence simply didn't exist at anywhere near this scale. Taiwanese officials have given this specific pattern of activity its own name, calling it Grayzone harassment, a deliberate strategy that stops just short of outright military conflict, but keeps steady, persistent pressure on Taiwan through constant, near-daily presence, rather than through any single dramatic act of aggression. China deploys military aircraft, warships, and Coast Guard vessels around Taiwan on an almost daily basis, specifically to assert its claim of sovereignty over the island, a claim that Taiwan's own government firmly and consistently rejects. Here's where this pattern gets genuinely important to understand, because it reveals something about China's broader long-term strategy that goes well beyond just this specific month's numbers. According to detailed joint analysis published by the Institute for the Study of War and the American Enterprise Institute, China began conducting regular Coast Guard patrols around Kinmen, a small Taiwanese-controlled island sitting close to the Chinese mainland, back in February of 2024, and then expanded that exact same pattern to include regular patrols around Pratas Island starting in February of 2025. And here's the part that should genuinely concern you. Chinese state-affiliated media has specifically hinted that this exact model, gradually normalizing persistent Coast Guard presence around one small island at a time, could eventually be extended to include all of Taiwan itself. Think about what that actually represents as a long-term strategy. Rather than attempting some single dramatic military invasion that would immediately trigger a massive international response, China appears to be testing a much slower, much more patient approach, normalizing its own persistent presence around smaller, more peripheral Taiwanese territories first, specifically to establish a template, a precedent, that it could eventually scale up to blanket the entire island, one incremental step at a time, each individual step small enough to avoid triggering the kind of unified, forceful pushback a sudden, dramatic move would likely provoke. This broader pattern of naval activity extends well beyond just the waters immediately surrounding Taiwan itself, too. According to Japanese Ministry of Defense reports, 10 Chinese warships transited through Japan's own maritime straits and headed toward the Pacific Ocean during the final week of June 2026 alone. Japanese officials specifically identified several of these vessels, including a frigate carrying hull number 599 and a guided missile destroyer carrying hull number 132, spotted sailing near Japan and heading toward open Pacific waters between June 26th and June 30th. This represents China actively exercising its ability to transit through Japan's stretch of what military strategists call the First Island Chain, a critical geographic barrier of islands that includes Japan, Taiwan, and the Philippines, historically viewed by American and Allied defense planners as a natural line of containment, specifically limiting China's ability to freely project naval power out into the broader Pacific Ocean. There's an even more dramatic data point buried inside this broader pattern too, one specifically involving China's own aircraft carrier fleet. According to reporting from Stars and Stripes, a Chinese aircraft carrier made a transit directly through the Taiwan Strait, marking the first time it had done so since the previous December. Think about the symbolism embedded in that specific move. An aircraft carrier isn't some routine Coast Guard vessel conducting a fishing patrol. It represents one of the single most visible, most powerful symbols of naval strength any country possesses, and sending one directly through the narrow, hotly contested waters of the Taiwan Strait sends an unmistakable message about exactly how confident China currently feels about projecting that kind of raw naval power directly through the most sensitive stretch of water in the entire region. Now, here's where I want to give you the most complete, most honest picture of this entire story, because not every single vessel movement happening around Taiwan right now can be automatically attributed to deliberate military escalation, and understanding that Nuance actually makes this whole story more genuinely credible rather than less. Chong Qing, a research fellow at the Taiwan-based Society for Strategic Studies and a retired naval captain himself, offered a genuinely reasonable alternative explanation for at least part of this recent surge in vessel movements. He suggested that many Chinese ships had likely left their home ports specifically to avoid destructive winds from an approaching typhoon, describing that kind of movement as a routine action aimed at preserving each vessel's own operational readiness, rather than representing some kind of unusual, deliberate military buildup. That's an important, honest piece of context to include here because it shows that not every single spike in vessel numbers automatically reflects a deliberate, calculated escalation. Sometimes, ships move simply because of weather, exactly the same way any navy anywhere in the world would reposition its vessels to avoid a dangerous storm. But here's exactly why that weather-related explanation doesn't actually undercut the broader, more troubling pattern we've been walking through together. It simply adds useful nuance to one specific data point within a much larger trend. Because at that exact same moment, China and Russia were beginning a joint exercise together, described officially as their Maritime Joint Exercise 2026, taking place in the Yellow Sea, in the waters between China and the Korean Peninsula. According to a Taiwanese official named Tsai, who commented specifically on this joint exercise, China and Russia typically conduct only 1 or 2 joint air patrols and naval exercises together each single year, specifically designed to showcase their strategic coordination on the broader geopolitical stage. He made a particularly important point about the significance of this specific exercise too, explaining that by deliberately expanding both the scope and the geographic reach of these joint drills, Beijing and Moscow appear to be working together, specifically to counter the defensive arrangements that American allies have put in place along that exact same first island chain we discussed a moment ago. Think about what that actually means when you put these two pieces together, the typhoon-related vessel movements happening on one hand, and a deliberately expanded joint Chinese-Russian naval exercise happening at the exact same time on the other. Even if part of the recent surge in ship numbers genuinely does reflect ordinary routine weather avoidance, that same period also happened to overlap directly with a deliberately expanded joint military exercise between China and Russia, specifically designed to test and probe the exact defensive arrangements the United States and its allies have built to contain Chinese naval expansion in the first place. That's not really a coincidence you can simply explain away with a single typhoon. There's also some genuinely positive context worth including here too, because a complete, honest picture of this situation requires acknowledging it. According to that same detailed AEI and Institute for the Study of War analysis, Taiwan's own defense ministry reported 12 consecutive days during June of 2026 without a single Chinese aircraft incursion across what's known as the median line, an unofficial but historically respected boundary running through the middle of the Taiwan Strait that both sides had largely honored for decades before China began more aggressively crossing it in recent years. 12 straight days without a single incursion represents a genuinely meaningful positive data point, suggesting this entire situation isn't simply moving in one single uninterrupted direction of constant, ever-worsening escalation. There have been real, documented periods of relative calm mixed in among the broader pattern of rising pressure we've been discussing throughout this entire story. On the diplomatic side of this equation, there have also been at least some attempts at direct engagement worth mentioning here. President Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping discussed global flashpoints, including the situation involving Taiwan specifically, during a summit meeting. Though according to that same detailed analysis, the two leaders did not reach any major agreements regarding either Iran or Taiwan during those specific discussions. Separately, Taiwan's own legislative UN speaker, Han Kuo-yu, led a multi-partisan Taiwanese delegation to meet directly with members of the United States Congress, specifically advocating for Taiwan's continued international participation and discussing broader trade and security issues facing the island. So, when you put together every single piece of this picture, the steadily rising number of Chinese vessels detected around Taiwan month over month, a near constant 5 to 6 warship presence maintained throughout the entirety of 2025. An aircraft carrier making its first Taiwan Strait transit since December, 10 warships transiting through Japan's own maritime straits toward the Pacific, a deliberately expanded joint Chinese-Russian naval exercise specifically designed to test Allied defensive arrangements, alongside the honest, important nuance that some of this movement likely reflects routine weather avoidance rather than pure military escalation. And 12 full days in June without a single Chinese aircraft incursion across the median line, you start to understand exactly why American defense officials describe this entire situation, using a specific, carefully chosen phrase, Grayzone pressure, rather than simply calling it an imminent, immediate military threat. This is exactly why the Pentagon is watching every single second of Chinese naval movement around Taiwan right now, and it's honestly not primarily because any single vessel movement on its own represents some kind of immediate five-alarm crisis. It's because the cumulative pattern, month after month, incident after incident, matters enormously more than any single individual data point ever could on its own. China patrolling around Kinmen back in 2024. That same pattern expanding to Protus Island in 2025. Chinese state media specifically floating the possibility of eventually extending that exact same model to blanket the entire island of Taiwan. A steadily climbing monthly count of vessels, 263 in June alone, compared to just 171 during that exact same month just 1 year earlier. A persistent, near-constant warship presence maintained throughout the entirety of 2025. An aircraft carrier transit through the strait for the first time in over half a year. Joint exercises with Russia specifically designed to probe and test the exact defensive arrangements American allies have built throughout the region. Every single one of these individual pieces, taken entirely on its own, might reasonably be explained away as routine, as weather-related, or as an isolated one-off incident. But taken together as one continuous, unmistakable trend line stretching across multiple consecutive years, they paint a picture of a country systematically, patiently, incrementally, normalizing its own persistent military and paramilitary presence around an island whose own government has absolutely no interest in accepting Beijing's claim over it. That's really the core insight underlying why the Pentagon treats every single one of these individual ship movements with such genuine seriousness, even the ones that might individually look routine or explainable on their own terms. Because in a strategy built specifically around gradual, incremental normalization, rather than one single, dramatic, headline-grabbing act of aggression, the entire danger lies precisely in how easy it becomes to dismiss each individual step as simply not that big a deal, right up until you eventually look back and realize just how much cumulative ground has actually been covered, one seemingly small, explainable movement at a time. Kinmen normalized in 2024, Protus normalized in 2025. A steadily rising vessel count throughout 2026, persistent warship presence maintained for an entire year straight. Each individual step small enough to explain away on its own terms, weather, routine exercises, standard patrol patterns, but together forming a pattern that Taiwanese officials themselves have now explicitly and publicly labeled as harassment, and that American defense officials are tracking with genuinely intense scrutiny specifically because of where this exact pattern, if it continues along its current trajectory, could eventually lead. That's the real story hiding underneath a single headline about Chinese warships moving toward Taiwan. It's not really a story about one single dramatic naval movement happening in isolation. It's a story about a patient, incremental, carefully calibrated strategy that's been quietly building for years now, one small island at a time, one slightly higher monthly vessel count at a time, one additional joint exercise with Russia at a time, each individual piece easy enough to dismiss or explain away on its own, but adding up month after month, year after year, into exactly the kind of sustained, persistent pressure campaign that keeps American defense officials watching every single vessel movement around Taiwan with the kind of a close, sustained attention that a single isolated incident would never actually warrant on its own. If this breakdown of exactly how steadily this pressure has actually been building around Taiwan genuinely surprised you, drop a comment below and let me know whether you think this pattern is eventually heading toward a genuine, direct confrontation, or whether you think this kind of gradual, incremental pressure campaign can actually continue indefinitely without ever crossing into open conflict. Because honestly, when you lay out this entire multi-year trend line together, it becomes a lot easier to understand exactly why American and Taiwanese officials are taking this so seriously right now. And if you made it all the way through this one with me, share it with someone who still thinks the Taiwan situation is just about the occasional dramatic headline every few months. Because as this story shows, the real pattern here has been building steadily, patiently, and deliberately for years now, one small step at a time. We'll keep tracking exactly how this pressure campaign continues evolving in the months ahead. So stick around, because based on everything we just walked through, this particular story is very far from finished.